DraftKings wide receiver breakdown. I'm Jason Gilbo, JGilbo11. With me is Justin Elick at Big Italy 42. Taking a look at wide receivers, and you got some different ones here because obviously you did the FanDuel ones and taking a look at a couple different options. And starting with one here, Odell Beckham, obviously a guy you talked about instead of Julio Jones.
Yeah, and I mean, also I mentioned there, don't think that I'm crazy, but of course Julio Jones is a great play on every site. You can make your own site before Sunday, and he'd still be a great play on that site too, I'm sure. But yeah, Odell Beckham, if you look at his numbers last year against the Cowboys, they were actually, I say pedestrian, which is probably kind. 9 catches on 14 targets for 79 yards, no touchdowns. I'm not reading too much into that. I know people in the beginning of the new season like to look back at game logs, and when there's been a lot of success, I feel like I'll read more into it. But when someone struggles, particularly if it's not, a specifically tough matchup, like the Mike Evans thing wasn't great against Atlanta last year, but Desmond Trufant, obviously, big reason for that. But, with Odell Beckham, obviously with more weapons in this offense now, finally, it's not just Eli Manning throwing to Beckham and, Will Tye and like Ruben Randall and nobody else. I mean, nobody wants Ruben Randall now. Like, that's how bad that situation was. And he was still getting a ton of targets. So, I mean, he's about as safe of an option as it gets. Great thing about DK, of course, you get that 100-yard bonus where, you roster a guy like Odell Beckham and you don't get 100 yards and, you're not happy at all because you're expecting that if you're paying almost $9,000. And I mean, I don't think he's going to have any trouble getting there this week. I do think Dallas will be able to score some points this week too, so they're going to need to throw the ball. And like we mentioned before, this Giants running game, maybe it gets better this year. I'm not holding my breath for that because it hasn't been good in years.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I mean, as you talked about that 100-yard bonus, interesting stat here. I mean, you said he hit eight times last year, so it's obviously 50% of the time he was hitting that mark, which is obviously what you want. I'm with you. I mean, you obviously look at the games. So we talked about Eli Manning being very average against Dallas last year, but this is still not a good defense. This is still a games in the past before 2015 where we saw just shootouts in 27-24 games, 31-28 games. It's just they get into those types of roles. But obviously a little bit different here with some of the new guys on Dallas. But I'm in agreement. OBJ always a great option.
Yeah, and I mean, Dallas 30th against number 1 wide receivers last year. So just imagine how bad they had to be against everyone else that Beckham didn't even have a single good game against them. And the 2 times he played them, and they still were 30th in the league.
Yeah. So, I mean, we'll take our chances here.
That's a risk I'm willing to take. And if it doesn't pan out, I'll just play him next week.
Yeah. Doug Baldwin's the next one here. You talk about 6,600. Certainly a nice price here for Baldwin, who obviously touchdown machine last year in Seattle. A price for him, and I'm definitely in agreement that he's a cash game option.
Yeah, I mean, obviously looking at the game logs, it looks like he's got 40-plus point upside. You're going to be waiting a long time if you're waiting for that game because it's probably not coming this year. But that's fine. I mean, paying 6,600, you're good with whatever you get with Baldwin. And I think the thing that's going to keep people off him this week in cash games, at least, is the 10.5-point spread, which is understandable. But I went back and looked at some of their games. Obviously, second half of the season, Seattle really turned it on, had a bunch of blowout wins. They won 5 of their last 6 games. They won. They won all those by at least 9 points. And his point totals in those games: 41.5, 26.4, 20.5, 28.8, and 9.6. So certainly on the lower end of that than the higher end, but I mean, I think he's a safe bet for 8 to 9 targets, 70, 80 yards. I mean, we know he's a good red zone threat. Russell Wilson loves throwing to him in the red zone. Obviously, with potentially Thomas Rawls not being 100%, Christian Michael, maybe he gets the bigger role, or maybe they just throw the ball more. And I just think he's a really safe option. His numbers target-wise for the season didn't look great at 6.4, but almost 8 per game in the second half of the season. So looking at, how the season ended rather than the full body, he looked like a very, very consistent option.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things I mentioned with those targets, they're super efficient. I mean, You look at Russell Wilson, I mean, he's giving you quality looks every time. So sure, he may not have 10, 12 targets, but you know what? He's getting consistent looks at 6 or 7. That's certainly fine with me.
Yeah.
Heading into GPP territory, and you probably have to say this is your boldest call of the night here with Julian Edelman.
Yeah, I mean, He's just one of those guys. I don't know. Apparently, my phone's freaking out, but definitely he's one of those guys that nobody's really going to be on. Obviously, Tom Brady's injured, so that in itself is going to keep people off him. He's facing Arizona, which is going to keep people off him as well. But his price at 6,100, this is a guy that it seems strange from a GPP perspective because, he doesn't have that big play upside. In fact, he only had 2 catches of 30 yards or longer last year. But you're not playing Julian Edelman to get you an 80-yard touchdown. You're playing Julian Edelman to get 13 targets in a game where the Patriots are behind and they need to score points, and he hauls in 10 catches for 105 yards and a score because, obviously that's best case scenario, but, volume in itself, you don't know how Garoppolo's going to do against that pass rush, which is one of the better ones in the league. He's going to be looking at a short passing game, and like I mentioned here, if I'm Arizona, I'm not worried about Julian Edelman beating me with 10 to 12 catches underneath potentially. I'm worried about Rob Gronkowski, just smashing my entire defense down the field. So I'm worried about stopping Gronkowski, and I'm going to let Edelman have all the underneath passes all day long.
Yeah, it's definitely a good point. I mean, that's a scenario that I could certainly see playing him out. And especially, it works well here on DraftKings. One, certainly a reasonable price is 6,100, but also you got that full point PPR, which is really what you're kind of implying when he gets those 10 catches. That really gives him a nice, even a decent floor for kind of what you're risking.
Yeah, and you think about the fact that obviously they're missing Brady. We already mentioned that, but Deion Lewis is out too. And the Patriots are huge in that short passing game. I'm sure they're not going to change the offense for Jimmy Garoppolo temporarily for a couple weeks. So, we saw Deion Lewis lining up all over the field like how Edelman does, and him getting involved in a lot of ways. So I don't really have a whole lot of faith necessarily in guys like James White taking over that role. So I think Edelman might get a couple extra looks here, and I just think he's going to be low owned. And I could be dead wrong on this one, but for 6,100, I'm going to take my chances.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot more, you look at the salary, I think that risk is certainly worth taking. Next one here, out of the kind of elite wide receivers out of that top tier, DeAndre Hopkins, certainly kind of, I'm not going to say overlooked, but out of that kind of core there, probably going to be the least highest owned.
Yeah, and that's a lot of the reason why I was pointing him out there. Obviously, the matchup is good against the Chicago team that was 31st in the league against wide receivers last season, or against number 1 wide receivers, I should say. And they were just about dead last in most defensive categories. So, obviously change at quarterback, but it's from one guy that a lot of people didn't trust. So actually, there were 4 guys last year that none of us trusted. But then now you got Brock Osweiler. We don't really know what to expect from him. But, the one thing that's consistent in this offense is the fact that it doesn't matter who's throwing the football. You throw it near DeAndre Hopkins, and he makes it happen. And, the best stat that I saw was the fact that only Julio Jones had more double-digit target games than Hopkins. Jones had 14, mentioned that earlier. Hopkins had 13, which was higher than even Antonio Brown last year. So, you factor all that in, the fact that he's got a nice floor. It's a good matchup for him. And, he's got a big ceiling. So he's one of those guys that a couple of times last year we saw him on the $1 million lineup, and all this hype about every other big receiver, not a whole lot talking about Hopkins.
Yeah, I definitely like him as a swerve. As you mentioned, he was just used so heavily last year. 192 targets, as you pointed out, 12 per game. And then you listed the guys here. It makes me sad that these guys are actually NFL quarterbacks, but he managed to do that type of season with guys like TJ Yates, Brandon Whedon, Ryan Mallett. So
I wasn't even going to write them all, but it just kind of accentuated the point to talk about every single one of those scrubs. Yes. But not Brian Hoyer.
No,
just he's not. I still love Brian Hoyer.
No, yeah, he is not a scrub. Let's get that out there.
Yeah, thank you.
In terms of value here, we talked a little bit about Tajay Sharp already, but obviously, here at 3K, it still makes all the sense in the world here for a value.
Yeah, he's barely above minimum, of course, on FanDuel, but he's absolute minimum on DK. 3,000, obviously got flex spot you can deal with. You can do whatever you want. And cash games in particular, you're going to want the Julio Joneses of the world and Todd Gurley if you want to pay up at running back and things like that. Adrian Peterson, maybe you want to go that route, whatever you want to do. You're going to need guys like Sharp. And like we mentioned with guys like Sharp and Spencer Ware, the cheaper they get on some of these sites, the tougher it is to fade them, and the more it could potentially hurt you, not only in cash games, but we've seen in GPPs on DK, some of these guys at men's salary being 40-50% owned in some of these, and you see that guy score a touchdown, you don't have him at min salary, there goes your chance of not only not winning the tournament, but you're not cashing more than likely.
Right. Yeah, it's certainly a good point. I mean, as we kind of we talked about this on FanDuel, less an ideal matchup, but it's more for the reasons that you just stated. So, in terms of your next one here, Willie Snead, I mean, 4,800. Obviously, I just feel like any wide receiver that's going to be involved in this game is going to be a target.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously you and I and many other people played DFS last year for NFL, and for those that didn't, I mean, Snead was one of the best cash game options every week. And I don't remember what his price ended up being at the end of the year last year. I don't think it was much higher than this, if at all. But I just think he's significantly underpriced for a guy that had almost 1,000 yards receiving last year. Only had 3 touchdowns, but had over 100 yards in only 2 games. Obviously, he's not the number one there. But like you mentioned, high total, Drew Brees at home. Willie Snead's a guy that Drew Brees trusts to, help him move the chains, get the ball down the field. And not much of a big play threat, like we mentioned, with the 3 touchdowns. His yards per reception, I believe, was like about 13, which is decent, but it's not great. So he's a guy that you're not expecting a huge game, but if you want to plug in a guy for cheap, that's probably going to get you 13 to 16 fantasy points. I mean, I think Snead's your guy.
Yeah, definitely good. I mean, especially when you're rostering 3 wide receivers, I mean, and a flex. I mean, you can take that. You just take those nice points and kind of spend up elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you pair him and Tajay Sharp, and all of a sudden you can – yeah. Everyone else is going to do that too. So you got to be different somewhere.
So let's wrap things up with the DraftKings wide receiver breakdown. Be sure to check out DaveFantasyCafe.com for all great tools and content.